we should get started because whoever can come will join us. The door is open. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our first event in the Tocqueville program series. Our guest today is Dr. David Hart. David is an Australian, born in Sydney, Australia, came to the United States where he studied at Stanford, and then went to Cambridge where he got his PhD in history at King's College, Cambridge. He has been working with Liberty Fund for the last 17 years or so. He's currently the director of the online Library of Liberty project at Liberty Fund, which is based in Indianapolis. He's the academic editor of Liberty Fund's translation of the collected works of Frederick Bastiat. This is a work in progress. 6 volumes are scheduled to appear. 3 have been published to date. The 4th one is forthcoming, from what I know. And he has been the editor and the co-translator of Gustave de Molinari's Evenings on St. Lazarus Street, Discussions on Economic Laws and the Defense of Property in 1849. David's areas of research are the history of classical liberal thought in general and French classical liberal tradition in particular. Today I invited David to speak to us about 2 things in particular. I'm interested in giving everyone a sense of the importance of Bastiat's ideas, especially in an age in which free trade is being challenged. So the notion of tariffs has been discussed again over and over, and Bastiat was a critic of tariffs and a defender of free trade. So for that matter, I think it's important to remember his work. Secondly, given David's extensive experience as an editor, I wanted to give all of us a sense of what does it mean to edit these beautiful books that Liberty Fund has been putting up for a long time. I just want to remind all of us that there is a library upstairs in the library of the workshop. Liberty Fund has generously given us all of their books that they edited over the years. It's a tremendous asset, and I hope that you will have a chance to avail yourself of that. David will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then there are some things that he has circulated, and we'll have a chance to ask questions. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you. Thank you, Aurelian, for inviting me. How many of you have heard of Frederick Bastiat? Okay, so there are a few. This is the man. The title is The Seen and the Unseen, which is obviously a pun on one of his best-known works, What is Seen and What is Not Seen, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. Some reflections on editing his work and his continuing relevance today.
I'm going to pass a copy of the book.
As Aurelian said, this was a big project that was undertaken, began in 2001, which was the 200th anniversary of Bastiat's birth. And a contingent of board members from Liberty Fund and some free market economists from the US went to his birthplace in Mugron to talk about his importance, and it was agreed that Liberty Fund would translate his complete works for the first time in English. Something like 1.25 million words that he wrote. I wanted to talk a little bit about that project, some editorial and translation issues that I've come across that you might find interesting, an academic aspect, which is, I think, there is a group of economists that were based in Paris, which are called the Paris School of Political Economy, which lasted throughout most of the 19th century, which is not well studied and not well understood, and of which Bastiat was a leading representative, and I think there's a lot more research that could be done in this area. I'll talk a little bit about his continuing relevance in terms of free trade, and also his critiques of socialism, which was emerging with some power in the 1840s. And then, if time permits, I'm going to talk about filming Freddie. I'll leave that cryptic for the moment, if we have time at the end. So these are the three volumes that have appeared so far. Each one is about 800 pages, so there's a huge amount of work. He wrote all this in 6 or 7 years, and I'll explain a little bit how he came to do that. This is the cover of one of our most beautiful books. The first handout I gave you is a list of books that Liberty Fund has published to do with French political and economic thought. Some we have republished, translations from the 19th century. About half of them are new translations. So we have an ongoing program to try and bring some of these important thinkers, make them better known to the English-speaking world. You can get all of these books, you can read them free online at the Online Library of Liberty website, or you can buy them from Liberty Fund. I also include this one because she's the only pin-up that we have of the liberal school in France. So who was Frederick Bastiat? The handout I've given you just gives you a summary of his life and work. Basically, he was born in a small town in Bayonne, down here near the Pyrenees, in Gascony, and he worked, he inherited some, his parents died when he was quite young. He was brought up by his grandmother and an aunt. When his grandparent died, he inherited property, and he was a small landowner in this part of France, small town of Mugron. And he spent, he was appointed as a magistrate, local magistrate in the town of Mugron. And even though he had no legal training, he was regarded as a very efficient and fair judge. And he was very intellectually curious. He went to an experimental school in Sorèze, where instead of learning Greek and Latin, which was the traditional French approach to education, he learned modern languages, music, poetry, and business studies. And this put a very interesting stamp on his mind. He loved the cello. He liked poetry, and he won a prize at school for writing poetry. So for the first 43 years of his life, he lived in Mugron. But he had this voracious intellectual appetite, especially for economics. And he spent 20 years of his adult life reading everything he could get his hands on economics in 4 different languages. He spoke Spanish, Italian, French, and English, which is quite extraordinary. This is the Place Bastiat in Mugron, named after him. The region of France where he lived has got some peculiarities. One of them is that the local shepherds walk about on stilts. And I was doing some research, trying to find out something about the local colour. Couldn't figure out. They still, even as late as the late 19th century, early 20th century, local boys would have fights on stilts as part of a sort of a village celebration. And the reason anyone figure out why they would be wearing stilts?
No idea.
The countryside was heath. How do you find a sheep in the heathland? You have to be higher, so you can see over the heath and see where your sheep are. So they would walk about on their stilts. So it's very strange. And of course in Gascony they have a thick Gascon dialect. He spoke Basque as well. They have bullfights, so there's a very strong Spanish influence. When he went to Paris at the tender age of 43, the Parisian economists mocked him because of his accent and his country clothes. And this is looks like a landowner dressed, something from the 1820s, in inspecting his tenants in land that he might have owned. So Bastiat might have looked a bit like that. And there's some very funny stories about when he was first met in Paris, them laughing at his backward country clothes. This is a picture of Paris when, or a map of Paris when Bastiat would have gone there in 1844-45. And in 1841, Prime Minister Thiers was persuaded the king to build this massive fortification around the city of Paris in order to stop the British from ever invading again. And so we have the 18th century customs gates, which was the inner wall, these new fortifications built between 1841 and 44, huge expense, having to resume vast amounts of land, taking it from local owners, to build these glacis around the wall where they could have an open line of fire to prevent the British ever seizing Paris again. Then they had this string of 16 star-shaped forts around Paris, which would provide interlocking artillery fire to prevent Paris from being taken. And this was one of the things that concerned the economists at the time, was the huge public works, the amount of labour that was required. They used conscripts from the army to do a lot of the digging. They had to resume land. So this is one of the key economic problems when Bastiat arrived in Paris. What did he accomplish in his life? He died at the age of 49. I think from throat cancer, from the descriptions he gives in some of his correspondence. He complained about a lump in his throat and inability to swallow, losing his voice. So it could have been, it could be esophageal or it could be tracheal cancer, I'm not sure. But what happened, what he did was, after 20 years of research, private research on economic thought, he comes across the writings of Richard Cobden and the Anti-Corn Law League, which was becoming a power in England in the early 1840s. And he is a passionate supporter of free trade, and he wanted to build a French equivalent of the Anti-Corn Law League that Cobden had built in England. And in 1846, Cobden and the Anti-Corn Law League is able to get a free trade legislation passed in the British Parliament. And Bastiat was very keen to get to Paris and start a French free trade movement and do the same thing to France that Cobden was doing in England. So one of the first things he does when he goes to Paris, when he's discovered by the Parisian economists, is he becomes the one of the principal leaders of the French Free Trade Association and the editor of their magazine. He becomes a journalist. He's one of the, regarded today as perhaps the greatest economic journalist who's ever lived. But what I've found in my research is that he was not only a great economic journalist, but he was also a very innovative and original economic theorist, which he has not yet received, I think, his due recognition. When the revolution breaks out in February 1848 and the Second Republic is created, the Parisian economists decide to shut down the Free Trade Association and focus on defending France from what they thought was a socialist attack, an attempt to take over the French government and implement socialist policies for the first time, and perhaps introduce the first measures of a modern welfare state, particularly the National Workshop Scheme, which was a scheme to provide labour for unemployed workers and pay for them at taxpayer expense. And Bastiat is able to get elected to the new chamber in 1848 and 49, where he becomes the vice president of the finance committee, where he's trying to balance the budget, he's trying to cut government expenditure, and he's trying to stop the socialist experiment of the national workshops. While he's doing all this, he's also trying to work on his treatise on economic theory called Economic Harmonies. He's doing this part-time. He's dying of cancer, struggling with pain, doing all his journalism, being a politician. I don't know how he fitted it all in. So between 1844 and 1850, when he died, he writes over 1 million words, which is what is going to constitute the 6 volumes of our collected works. In the process of doing this, I've come across all sorts of interesting editorial and translation issues. Things like, what models would you use to do a collected works? And the ones that I had particularly in mind is this wonderful collected works of Jean-Baptiste Say, which is being currently published by the Press Economica in Paris. There's meant to be 8 volumes, I think, and only 4 or 5 have appeared, but it's a model of editorial practice with their introductions, notes, glossaries. In the case of the treatise, Say's treatise, it is a variorum edition, which shows all the different changes that he made across 6 different editions. So it's a wonderful scholarly resource. So that was one of my models for this project. Another problem is getting the order right. This is a conflict that we had with the original editor, who's now dead, unfortunately. He wanted to do a thematic edition. I wanted, as a historian, I wanted to do a chronological edition. And that's, you could go either way. One of the problems with doing a collected works of an author is finding all the texts you didn't know about when you first started the project. Luckily, Volume 4, which has just been finished, was a miscellaneous writing, so we were able to dump all the new things we found into this Volume 4. putting his works in historical context and writing glossaries of people. This has been one of the most interesting but a very arduous task, is writing a couple of hundred glossaries. This is an example of one of them. When I talked earlier about the Paris schools, because they're so poorly known and understood, there's not a great deal of information. So the one I'm giving you here is Guillaumin. Guillaumin is extremely important because he was a young publisher, started a publishing firm in 1837, and his publishing firm became the most important network of classical liberals and political economists in the 19th century. His firm, named Guillaumin, between 1837 and when it went under in 1910, so 74-year existence, published 2,400 books. This is a massive publishing effort. Something like 38 volumes per year, consistently. It's just an extraordinary thing. I'll show you, I did a graph. This was one of the... Let's see if I can... got the graph here. How do I adjust that?
I don't know.
I'm going to show you that graph, which is eluding me at the moment.
We can still see it.
Yeah, okay. What I did was I graphed the number of books published per year over that 74-year period, showing you these 2,400 copies with spikes. So in 1848, Revolution broke out, they published 70 or 80 volumes that year. It's just an extraordinary publishing achievement. And Guillaumin was the central figure in this economic publishing network. Out of his building in Paris, which was on the Rue Richelieu, he started a political economy society where all the economists would gather together, meet, and then go off to have dinner at a restaurant. They had meetings, they had publishing, they had all sorts of other political activities, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this is one of the most important networks in which Bastiat moved, and it's virtually unknown. And when Guillaumin died in 1864, his firm was taken over and run for the rest of the century by his two daughters, which is a very interesting example of women involved as entrepreneurs and owners of an important business. No one's written the biography of either of his daughters. Go back to where I was before. One of the other things that had to be done was to get all of his works in chronological order and giving them a unique ID, dating them, their title in English and French, their place of original publication. His collected works were put together and edited in the 1850s and 60s, where you can find it in that edition and then where you'll be able to find it in our edition. And this is something like over 300 of these items, these articles and books that he wrote over the course of his life. So that was a very onerous task and still not yet finished. Another interesting editorial problem was, because Bastiat was an economic journalist, he's constantly quoting government expenditure, tax levels, and so on. And I couldn't find anywhere details of the budget, government expenditure, and income for the financial years of 1848-49. And so it took me some months to do this, reconstructed the French government budgets and stuck it in an appendix. And what that meant was that I was then able to, whenever Bastiat mentioned some economic expenditure or a tax or whatever, I was able to, in a footnote, reference this reconstructed finance, this data. And one of the things I wanted to do as an editor was to check how accurate he was as an economic journalist. He was spot on 99.9% of the time, which is quite extraordinary. So not only was he a gifted and beautiful writer and witty writer of journalism, but he was also economically and statistically accurate in everything he said.
Use the mouse to scroll.
I can work that out. No, that's not doing it. Lost it now. But the mouse here.
Yeah, just scroll.
I was able to do the same thing with plotting the budget data on pie charts, which was an interesting practice. What you'll notice there is that the biggest expenditure is the military, followed by paying off the government debt, which was caused by previous military conflicts. So it's this massive, public debt, 29%, and war, 22%. So that's quite interesting, I thought. Oh, what's happening now? Sorry. So here's an example of this amount of text, but this amount of footnotes explaining all the economic data that he refers to in the text. If you're interested, you can read it in more detail here. This is a fairly typical page in the book, and this makes editing this very time-consuming, and also gives my editor conniptions. Say that there are too many footnotes. And I said, Laura, there can never be too many footnotes. So again, what I'm trying to show here is that his economic journalism is extremely rich and dense, but also accurate. Some editorial and translation issues here. The consistency of word use. I found this particular problem. We've gone through three sets of translators. And you might have seen the reference there to The Curse of the Mummy. Everyone who's worked on this project has died. Like The Curse of the Mummy in the film, the people who invaded the Pharaoh's tomb in Egypt all meet grisly ends eventually. There's a payback from the mummy's ghost. So we've had deaths through old age, disease, and mishap. So I'm hoping that I can survive through the next 3 volumes before it's my turn. So what I said to one of the earlier translators was you have to draw up a word list, because we're dealing with 6 volumes being published over a decade. We've got to make sure that our word use is consistent. And our first translator didn't do that, and so that's been a problem to try and rectify. And one way in which I tried to draw up word lists was to do this mind mapping, or this concept mapping, which helped me get clear in my own mind what words he used, in what circumstances, what variations of words, or what pairings of words, often words used in opposition, like harmony or disharmony. And there are some very interesting programs out there that you can use to word map. So this one is his one on class. The other one on the back of it is a more complex one, which is his one on harmony and discordance, or disharmony. So what I tried to do here was to identify, his use of class. He was a very early... there is a second tradition about thinking about class, which is parallel to the Marxist and socialist tradition of thinking about class. The classical liberals, like Bastiat, also had their own terminology about class and plunder and exploitation, which is very important. There's indication in some letters that Marx knew the French liberal tradition and borrowed some of his ideas about class from these early French historians in particular. So here I tried to bring together his ideas about things like, he talked about stratum, la couche. He talked about social class, the working class. He talked about oligarchies. He particularly hated the English landed aristocracy. He called them an oligarchy. But his main idea was that classes were political, that whoever controlled the government could was a ruling class. They could get benefits and privileges, whether that was protection or subsidies or monopoly rights, special favours. He thought that constituted a class, and he thought that the process of class exploitation was what he called la spoliation, plunder. And he has a whole theory, a whole series of words using the word plunder and spoliation, the plundering class, the plundered classes. And so I'm trying to, in these maps, you'll see in the corner here some synonyms. And so this was one way in which I was able to try and clarify in my own mind what the how we could keep translating this consistently. This is one on more complex one. Here's another one on human action. Now, Bastiat, one of the things that's really interesting about using technology to do a translation is that I was able to put all 1.25 million words of Bastiat's stuff in French into one file that I could then do word searches. I'd have all the files in chronological order. So I could say, well, do a word search of when was the first time he used the phrase, the plundering class? And then how often did he refer to that? And then see how it might have changed over time as he was writing. And I found this extremely useful. This particular terminology is interesting because the idea of human action is associated with the Austrian school of economics, which appeared in the 1870s, in particular in the 20th century with Hayek and von Mises, for whom the idea of human action was central to their economic theory of why people behave, how they behave, what are they trying to get when they act in an economic situation. And I found by using these search tools, I found out that Bastiat was using this term 20 years before the Austrian economists were in the 1870s, doing this in the 1850s. And you were able to make pairs, to act, agir. You have acting man, agissant. There's un agent, an actor. There is action or an activity. And there are these clusterings of words around particular concepts. So there is an acting being, an acting human, and again, a bunch of synonyms. And these are some of the main word clusters that I have come across in analysing Bastiat's writings. And many of these are related to each other. So his idea of human action is that it's related to his definition of exchange was the mutually beneficial exchange of one service for another service. He was getting away from commodities, he was getting away from money, he was more interested in service, how we provide each other with different services. Anyway, I won't bore you too much longer. This is his one on plunder, which I find particularly fascinating. Another thing about the translation is not just the clumping together of or clustering of words to explain or describe particular actions or concepts, but he also has what I call a rhetoric of liberty. He has a way of phrasing his arguments which are unique to him, and he's trying to make a particular point to persuade a reader. In particular, he's trying to popularise economics for people who are not experts. And he does this in a very seductive and very powerful way. So he uses humour and satire because he thinks economics is too dry and boring. That's one of the things that made Bastiat famous in his own day was his collection of what he called economic sophisms, which were brilliantly funny and clever attacks on people who defended protectionism or wanted government regulation of the economy or subsidies for powerful vested interests. He also is very interesting because he says you have to use the right terminology, and when someone forces you to do something or takes your property, either for a subsidy to give to a privileged business person, that is theft. And he has this whole vocabulary of words to describe different types of theft. And he says we have to use this vocabulary to describe it because this is in fact what's happening in the real world. He also is innovative as a popularizer of economics because he uses stories to explain economic concepts. And at this he was brilliant. Because of his educational background, he was interested in poetry and drama, and he would often draw upon playwrights like Molière or the writer of fables, La Fontaine. So he could use stories and characters that would be known to French people through their own education to show how his economic ideas could be explained. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. He also made up his own stories, not just borrowing upon French culture, but he would make up his own stories. There was a character called Jacques Bonhomme, which is like an American expression would be Joe Sixpack, right, the everyday guy. Jacques Bonhomme is a character that constantly recurs in Bastiat's writings, where he is the clever peasant, the French peasant, who is doesn't want to be fooled by the government or by fast-talking business people who want privileges and handouts. He's sceptical, and during the 1848 revolution, one of the things that Bastiat and some of his younger friends in the economics movement did was they would start their own little magazines, which they would hand out on the streets of Paris in the middle of the revolution. So once they did one in February and March of 48, and again in June, and on both occasions there was violence in the streets and the troops were shooting protesters, and Bastiat and his friend Molinari would be under fire, handing out these free trade magazines on the streets of Paris. That's quite unusual behaviour for an economist, I would say. Anyway, so he named one of his magazines Jacques Bonhomme, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And then what's most brilliant, I think, about his use of economic stories is his use of the Robinson Crusoe character. You know, what would Robinson Crusoe do? What sort of economic decisions would Robinson Crusoe make all alone on the island of despair where he's been shipwrecked? And Bastiat would talk then about how he has to economise on his scarce resources, he has to set aside time to build a capital good of some kind, like a fishing line, and to do that he has to sacrifice doing something else, like he may have to work hard to create a stock of food and then work on his building his capital stock. And so he takes the reader through the basic steps of how an economy works just by using the simple story of Robinson Crusoe. And Murray Rothbard, who is a very important economist and political theorist in the modern libertarian movement, writing in the 1950s and 60s, came across Bastiat's use of Robinson Crusoe and used it as the foundation stone for his reinterpretation of Austrian economics. It's all in the footnotes. If you read Man, Economy and State, constantly referring to Robinson Crusoe, and he got that from Frederick Bastiat. So here's just a list of some of the rhetorical devices that Bastiat uses. I've made a list of them in this handout, and you'll just, I think, be amazed at the variety of stories, and he invents documents. He has fictitious petitions to government. He has these stories. He does satires. He does parodies. I'll give you a copy a moment of one of his most brilliant parodies of a passage from Molière. All this to make economics less dull and boring. This was actually extremely difficult to translate and to edit. This is his parody of a parody. You can imagine how complex that can get. At the end of Molière's play, The Hypochondriac, Molière was suffering terribly from a disease which eventually killed him. He was being treated by a doctor, and he thought all doctors were quacks, that they were causing him more pain than his disease, especially with using leeches to bleed you and so on. And so at the end of the Hypochondriac, he has Molière inserted an appendix where he has, it's all in Latin, and he has a parody where he has an induction ceremony for a young doctor who wants to become a full professional doctor. And the young doctor has to recite this pledge, right, this oath of being a doctor, an oath, where he promises to inflict pain and suffering on all his patients. So in the footnote, at the bottom of the page, I have to explain this, but as an editor. So most of the dialogue is in Latin, including the swearing in of a new doctor, and then he has this made-up Latin. This is pig Latin or table Latin or whatever the expression is. So it's part Latin, part French, part nonsense. And one translation is, I give and grant you power and authority to practice medicine, to purge, to bleed, to stab, to hack, to slash, and kill with impunity throughout the whole world. Right, this is Molière venting his spleen at doctors he didn't like. So what does Bastiat do? Bastiat takes this and then rewrites it in Latin as an oath of induction for a tax collector or a customs collector. And so this is again explained this is the body of the text. This is what the tax collector, this invented tax collector, promises to do in order to become a fully professional tax collector. He says, I give to you and I grant virtue and power to steal, to plunder, to filch, to swindle, to defraud at will along this whole road. And people who knew, like French people who knew their Molière, would instantly know what this meant and its significance and would laugh. Of course, for the modern reader, the translator and editor has to explain all these jokes to the reader. And there's probably nothing less funny than a joke that has to be explained in a footnote. And I have to confess to having committed that crime several times in trying to make Bastiat more understandable to the modern reader. So it was fun doing this, I must say, but a lot of hard work. And this is, again, where technology comes into the picture. I was able to use Google Books to find a lot of these quotes without having to go into, spend weeks and weeks in a big research library. I could do it from my office desk in Indianapolis, and I could find possibly the editions of Molière that Bastiat might have read, and to check it. Because one of the tricks he did was he would sometimes rephrase a famous and well-known passage from Molière, where Molière would refer to a politician who was Molière's contemporary, and Bastiat would change the reference to be a politician that was Bastiat's contemporary. Again, this would be very funny to someone who knew their Molière. And it was by checking the footnotes using Google Books, I was able to find out that he would make these substitutions and modernise some of these references. He also is great at inventing funny names, like he called the tax collector Mr. Blockhead, just to mock them. And then there are other puns on words which I won't have time to explain. I'll skip this, I'm running out of time. But just, this is my term for Google fingers. If any of you who've used Google Books, originally when the program started, they would employ grad students at places like the University of Michigan to do this scanning of these hundreds of thousands of books. And they would do it so quickly that they would not have time to move their hands from the table before the picture was taken. And so I have a collection of what I call Google fingers, which is extremely irritating when the passage you want to read is covered by some grad student's hand. Sometimes you can see how bad their manicure is. They chew their nails, or they have rings or tattoos. It's really quite funny what you can find on a Google finger. I've already mentioned the Curse of the Mummies problem of working on a project that takes so long. These are some posters from Lon Chaney's version of the film that was The Mummy's Tomb. And what I'll just say very briefly, because it's not it's a topic that's so vast I can't really go into it here, but in the process of uncovering the world in which Bastiat moved and the groups that he belonged to, like the writing for the Journal des Économistes, being a member of the Political Economy Society, being one of the founding, the president of the Free Trade Association, there are all these interesting networks of people. And I've written a paper that will be published in the Cambridge History of French Thought next year on the Paris School. I was told I had 7,500 words to write about the entire 19th century. I was able to persuade my editor to give me 10,000 words just to do the first half of the 19th century, and I ended up writing 80,000 words, which is almost a book. So because this is a completely unknown, I think, group of people who were very interesting, very productive economists who had this enormous influence, at least before the First World War in Europe and France. This is where the Guillaumin publishing firm is located, just down the street here on the left. It was there for 74 years. The Journal des Économistes, which is their main organ, first started publication in 1841. It lasted until 1940 when the Nazis invaded Paris and took over the Guillaumin building and trashed all their files and books. So it makes it very difficult for us to do history about the company because the Nazis destroyed all their records, which is so frustrating. Here's a list of some of the groups that I've been exploring. The Academy of Moral and Political Sciences was reconstituted in 1832 after the Revolution of 1830, and there was a political economy section, and that was a home for many of the economists. They could have a public platform, they could have their books published and discussed, and it gave them a great deal of credibility. There's the Guillaumin publishing firm, the Journal des Économistes, the French Free Trade Society. There's a Friends of Peace Society that these economists, because there was a strong link in their minds between free trade and peace. And in 1849, there was a meeting in Paris, and the president of that conference was Victor Hugo. Richard Cobden came over from England to give a major speech, and Bastiat was also one of the main speakers at the conference. So that's something I've discovered and didn't really know beforehand. But he's also a member of 3 private salons, and this also is something that hasn't yet been explored by historians. So these are social networks, usually run by wealthy and powerful women. So 2 that he belonged to was one run by Madame Hortense Chevreul, who was the wife of a very wealthy manufacturer, and then another salon run by Anne Say, who was her maiden name was Chevreul, so you can see the family interconnections between some of these groups, who was the wife of Horace Say, who was the son of Jean-Baptiste Say. And I think at Madame Chevreul's salon, Tocqueville also attended. There's a mention of him in one of the letters. So this is one way in which all these people, these politicians, these economists, interacted with each other. And Bastiat was a star at Madame Chevreul's salon because of his wit. He was notorious for singing drinking songs, which upset some of the more polite ladies, society ladies. He also told risque jokes in his broad Gascon accent. He persisted in wearing his Gascon jacket and umbrella, which shocked the elite of Paris, who liked to wear black suits and top hats, and he was walking around like a Gascon farmer. And he would also play the cello, which he'd learned at his experimental high school at Sorez, and he used to burst into song and play the cello at these salons. So Madame Chevreul found him to be a wonderful guest to have because of his entertainment value. And she says in a letter that he would always have bits of paper stuck in his jacket, and during the middle of the salon, during the evening, he would sneak off to continue writing his editorial for the next day to be published. So it was quite remarkable. So that's, again, something that's quite new and not well known, these networks for liberty, as I call them. Here we have the publishing. Let me just say something about filming Freddie, and then I'll open it up for discussion. We can talk about his ideas about free trade and socialism. But out of the blue, a few years ago, a film producer from Florida rang me up and said, I've been reading Bastiat's correspondence in your volume 1. It would be great to have a film about Bastiat because, he was involved in the revolution and he was a very interesting character. And he said, would you like to write the screenplay? And I said, I know nothing about writing screenplays. And he said, well, neither do the people, most of the people who submit screenplays to me don't know how to write screenplays. So I said, okay, I'll try that. And I did, and it took me 2 years. Nothing has come of it, unfortunately. It just sort of sank. But one of the things that was interesting to do is when you're trying to write a screenplay, you have to think in terms of visually. You know, what did Paris look like? What did the buildings look like where he might have gone to have these salons? What did Paris look like with these this fortification wall that Thiers had got built at the time? Things like that, which was very interesting. So I did a lot of research looking at illustrated magazines from the time to try and see what the streets of Paris looked like. And then I reread the correspondence, this time not looking for ideas and theories and so on, but looking for personal relationships and conflicts and trying to see it. And it gave me a completely different perspective on Bastiat. Again, it's a problem of how do you make a film about ideas? And have any of you seen the film Reds by Warren Beatty? Famous, very successful film from 1981, which won a whole lot of Oscars. It's about an American journalist, John Reed, who's a communist, who goes to Russia when the revolution breaks out in 1917 and writes an account of it, which became a very popular book. And then Warren Beatty makes this film about it. And it's a wonderful film about revolution, about ideas. It's just a pity it's very or very sympathetic to the communists. So what I wanted to do was write an equivalent, classical liberal free market equivalent of this wonderful film Reds, but this time situated in Paris and looking at the revolution from a free market classical liberal perspective. So I've called the film, the screenplay is called Broken Windows, because there were a lot of windows broken during the 1848 revolution when the troops, when the people were rioting in the streets and they built these barricades, used artillery firing down the streets of Paris to break up these huge barricades that had been built, and thousands of people got killed and injured. And Bastiat was an eyewitness to that. So there's some great sort of filmic moments in his life. Not to mention having those people on stilts. That'd be wonderful background shots before he moves to Paris. So why don't I stop there, and we can talk a little bit about some of his free trade ideas and anti-socialist ideas. Anything else you want to talk about?
Okay, thank you. Okay. Let me start the conversation. Just we'll open. We can take a few questions at a time. So Bastiat is today known mostly in libertarian circles. So the question that I would have for everyone is why those who are not libertarian, why should they care about Bastiat's work in particular? Feel free to add any questions you wish. You can start with that and then look at yours.
Well, even detractors of his economic theory, like Schumpeter, who wrote this wonderful history of economic analysis in 1953, which is this panoramic view of the history of economic thought, recognized that Bastiat was probably the best economic journalist who's ever lived, so he's worth reading because of his witty style, his clever way of arguing, the way he simplifies economic ideas. He's sort of a model economic journalist. So there's that side, whether you agree with him or not, he's just a brilliant writer. Another factor is that he was very active during the Second Republic, so for historical reasons, his work as a politician, his work as the vice president of the finance committee, he should at least get a few footnotes in the history books. He doesn't. When you read histories of 1848, especially if they're written by left-wing historians, the classical liberals that I've been talking about today barely write a mention. They're just completely invisible. So I think just to rectify the history books, their activities should be part of the broader story of what was happening in Paris in 1848. Also, I think, as I said, with his ideas about human action, he was a precocious innovator of economic ideas. He's not just sort of a proto-Austrian economist writing 20 years ahead of the invention of Austrian economics. His writings are full of public choice insights about how selfish behaviour by politicians and bureaucrats, which is the whole point about the public choice theory. Bastiat is using those sets of arguments to explain or to criticise political behaviour in his own day. So again, from the history of economic thought, he's worth studying because of his originality. And then if you happen to agree with free market economics, and he's just one of the greats of the 19th century, one of the great classical liberals of the 19th century.
Good.
Because that always struck me with he's very original, right? Public choice. I mean, the candlestick maker petition is rent seeking. I mean, it's totally rediscovered it. It's not there. So why do you think he kind of failed for this? So in your introduction here, you say he almost, if he had lived longer, he could have come to the subjective value theory that like Menger and them came up with. But that's one of the arguments that I've always heard as to why he was kind of not called a theorist. Like you mentioned Schumpeter. Well, Schumpeter called him the greatest economic journalist, and then in the same sentence says, but he was no theorist. And one of the arguments I've always heard is that he got value theory wrong, which made harmonies kind of fall apart. Why do you think is that accurate, or why did you think he would have come to this subjective?
David, can you explain the candle thing for those of us, or those in the room who don't know about it?
Yeah, one of his best-known economic sophisms. Economic sophisms were a collection of his journalism. That he published two collections, one in 1846 and one in 1848. And what he did was he said, vested interests use false or sophistic arguments to defend or justify the government giving them a privilege, or government protecting their industry from competition, or giving them a subsidy. So he wrote all these things which he called economic sophisms, where he exposed the falsity and the sophistical nature of these arguments. And these books sold in their hundreds of thousands, I think, and they were translated quickly into all the major European languages. Almost within 6 months of their appearing in French, there'd be a Danish translation of all things. And in this particular, this is an example of his rhetorical style, where he would invent a fictitious petition. And this was a petition of the manufacturers of candles, going to the government saying, we can't compete with a very cheap, low-cost competitor. Can you please pass legislation to force people to shut their blinds and block their windows during daylight hours because we can't compete with the sun? If you could stop people from using sunlight to enlighten their homes, they would buy more candles, and there'd be more jobs for the candle manufacturers. And once you go through the story and you see when the punchline is going to come, it's just uproarious. Of course, this is just an absurd thing. And he did 70 of these economic sophisms in a similar vein. So they're incredibly rich and interesting. To go back to your question, he did have a problem with value, but all the economists did. They were just floundering around because they were trying to... Bastiat at least realised that the labour theory of value was useless, and he was trying to get a new one that would overcome those problems, but didn't quite get there. Right? So he's likely to fail in that area. Another explanation is that he was trying to do too much. He knew his life was coming to an end, and he was racing to do all the things he wanted to do. He comes to Paris late, he's 43. He starts the free trade movement and does all this journalism. He gets elected to the Chamber of Deputies after the revolution, and works on the Finance Committee. As part of the economists' campaign against the socialists, which were becoming more and more powerful, Bastiat wrote over a dozen anti-socialist pamphlets, like The State or Law and Plunder. And then he's trying to do work on his treatise, and his friends kept saying, "Freddie, you've just got to stop all this stuff. Work on your treatise. You've got to finish it." And he never did. There was a time when Madame Chevreul, whom I mentioned, was able to help him rent this old hunting lodge that belonged to King Louis XIV on the outskirts of Paris. And they said, "We're going to lock you in this hunting lodge for the summer so you can finish your damn treatise." Right? And he did, and he wrote the first volume, but then got distracted again. And then towards the end, he was in such chronic pain. I think he was, sipping laudanum. Laudanum was an opium-based painkiller, and he would have just been, every day when he started coughing, he'd just be sipping. So he was in a bad state at the end. So it's partly intellectual confusion, partly total distraction. He lived through a revolution, partly his failing health and eventually, early death. Had he lived as long as Karl Marx, he wanted to write a book about the history of plunder. He wanted to write a book about economic disharmonies. Right? The first volume was going to be on economic harmonies, and what were all the things that disrupted harmony and economic prosperity, like plunder and war and slavery and theocracy and all these other things. But on the other hand, he might have screwed up on value, but he had other insights that are just quite extraordinary. He has one that I, again, found just by using word searches on my megafile of Bastiat's writings. I came across mistranslations in the old Foundation for Economic Education translation from the 1960s. It was, he called it was par ricochet, which I translated as the ricochet effect. And by ricochet, in his writings, he uses a lot of hydraulic metaphors to describe economic activity. It could be like streams of electricity. Like he had a concept of the flow of information through prices. Prices told manufacturers and entrepreneurs information about what the nature of the market was. So he's very Hayekian. And then, so he talks about water flows and levels and equilibrium. So he's got all these interesting metaphors. The ricochet effect was a thing that, by that he meant a flow-on effect. Right, that if you do have one economic intervention, that's going to have an effect on everything else. That there'll be a ripple or flow-on effect. He uses the term ricochet, like if you throw a stone around on a pond, it'll bounce and cause all these ripples across the pond. And so he had this very interesting notion about the ricochet effect. And again, it's some of his other writings. He has insights that would be associated later with Keynesianism. What's the term I can't remember the exact term. The multiplier effect. Right? Keynesian idea that if the government spends, puts money into the economy here, that will have a flow-on effect because that'll stimulate business somewhere else, and then this has this flow-on effect. And Bastiat had a very similar notion with his ricochet effect, and that's something I think that's been unappreciated. Tony de Jasse argues that Bastiat almost pretty well invented the whole idea of opportunity cost. The broken window story, which is one of his famous economic sophisms, which gets trotted out again and again every time there's a hurricane, and houses get damaged or windows get broken. People say, "Oh, that's going to be great for for industry. They're going to have to rebuild all these houses, and it's going to stimulate economic activity, and we're going to have brand new houses and brand new windows." And Bastiat says, "This is nonsense, right?" And he says that's the seen effect, immediate seen effect. The unseen effect often comes much later, and a good economist has to be waiting for the moment when the unseen does gradually become visible. And he says, well, what happens with the broken window? And he has this story about Jacques Bonhomme, one of his famous characters, has a shop, the shop window, and he's got a hooligan son who breaks the window, and everyone around Jacques says, "Oh, that's going to be great for the glazier." And Bastiat says, "Well, actually, no. First of all, you have the destruction of a capital good like a painted window. Jacques then has to dip into his savings to buy and have a new window installed. By doing that, the opportunity cost is he doesn't use his savings for something else. He could have left it in the bank earning interest, or he could have spent it on buying new clothes or buying a chicken for their weekend roast." He says these are all the unseen consequences. So just because you see a glazier making a profit out of a broken window doesn't mean that there's a net benefit for the economy. And of course, every time there's a flood or a hurricane, the broken window fallacy gets recirculated.
This is Huang Yuzhao.
I'm Huang Yuzhao. I'm a PhD student here in political science. I consider myself as a Tocquevillian. So I want to ask about Bastiat's critique of response to socialism, which was emerging at that time in general. I know Tocqueville's concern or critique of socialism was mainly from a political perspective. Tocqueville was concerned that the socialism would lead to further expansion and centralization of state power, which would threaten individual citizens' liberty. I would know whether there was also a political dimension in Bastiat's criticism of socialism. And you mentioned that he was against certain socialist program during the February Revolution, like the National Workshop. But at that time, socialism seemed to be a solution to the problems caused by free market economy, like the large scale of unemployment of the workers. So, what his suggestion for solving the economic problems caused by the failure or insufficiency of free market at that time? So, what is here?
Well, he had three sets of arguments that he would use against socialist writers like Louis Blanc or Victor Considerant or Proudhon, and they were moral arguments, they were economic arguments, and they were political arguments. The moral argument, which he, I think, preferred, was that anyone who takes your stuff without your permission is violating your property rights, whether it's the government or whether it's the socialists or whoever. So he said there's a moral problem. Like, we just have to stop people taking other people's stuff. An economic argument was we have all these incentive and disincentive problems, that if you subsidise unemployment, you'll get more of it. Right? If you tax individuals to transfer this money to other groups, this will cause distortions in the economy. It will cause the rise of more and more bureaucrats to administer the system. You get all sorts of inefficiencies. Again, this is where he introduces public choice analysis. That how can we be sure that the bureaucrats who manage the redistribution system will do it efficiently and the people actually get the money that they've been promised. But he also said that the reason why people are poor or unemployment is not a failure of the market system itself, but a failure of government. Right? And he says the biggest single expenditure that the French government has is on the military, and then paying the debt of previous military engagements and expenditure. He says if we want to help the ordinary person to start to build some capital of their own and to have some prosperity, we have to cut taxes. And the only way to cut taxes is to cut expenditure on the military. He said that's a bit like a big parasite that's sucking the blood out of the French economy. And there's a wonderful sophism where he's made dictator for a day. Right? So it's called the utopian. And the king comes to someone, obviously Bastiat in disguise, and says, well, I'm going to make you dictator for the day or a week. What are you going to do? And so Bastiat, or the character in the story, says, well, I'm going to slash tariffs because, they're making the price of food and clothes more expensive for the poor. We're going to cut subsidies to industry. Why should poor people be subsidising wealthy manufacturers so they don't have to compete against Belgian or English competition? But his most outrageous or provocative thing was, well, I'm going to abolish the army. Right? It's the biggest single thing. Like there were 400,000 men in the French military, costing 400 million francs every year. He said, I'm going to get rid of the standing army, save $400 million francs, which was a third of the budget. And I'm going to use the American system of local militias to provide defence for France. And he said that's the best way to solve poverty in France is to cut the taxes, cut the protection of industry and subsidies to industry and get rid of the army. And he said there's also a blood tax because the French had conscription. And when you turned 20, by lot, something like, I suppose, 70,000 young Frenchmen would be conscripted into the army for 7 years.
Wow. In 48?
Yeah. And so, since the average age of a person at that time was about 46, 45, 46. To lose, at the age of 20, to lose 7 years of your life when you're only going to live to be 45 or 46 is massive. That's what they call a blood tax. But to go back to your question, one of the things that the classical political economists found very hard to explain was the business cycle, and why were these periodic booms and busts, which caused unemployment. And one of Bastiat's contemporaries was a guy called Charles Coquelin, and he was a pioneer in the theory of free banking, which again became an interesting. Many modern Austrian economists are advocates of free banking. And they said the reason why we have these boom-bust cycles is because there is a central bank which issues too much money, causing a glut of money on the market, and business people make poor economic decisions because of that. Then there is an inevitable correction which causes unemployment and recession. And Coquelin, and Bastiat was a free banker himself, he said the best way to stop these economic recessions is to stop the government issuing too much paper money, and we have to have a strong gold-based monetary standard. And he said, if we can do that, then we're going to get rid of one of the major objections that the socialists have to the classical political economy and the free market is these periodic recessions and high unemployment.
I've already asked, so somebody else has to, but I do have one.
We can have a conversation.
Okay. So, what I personally find most interesting about Bastiat is how, in the thrust of his arguments, his reserves his fiercest attacks for attacks on entrenched interests, the political class, established business seeking to live off the state, and how he kind of frames the cause of classical liberalism as fundamentally populistic for the goal of the underclass. And in a day and age when partisans of classical liberal thought and free market economics are generally painted as defenders of entrenched interests and the corporate class that Bastiat's kind of the proto-corporatism that Bastiat was attacking. What do you think defenders of free markets today could kind of learn from his arguments?
Well, what he was defending was a consumer-centric view of economics, right? That nationalist economists or protectionists say that, if we want to have a strong French industry or French society, we need to have a strong manufacturing section. We need to have iron and steel. We need to have all this sort of stuff. And if we think there's not enough of it, we want the government to make sure that there's a strong iron and steel industry and a strong manufacturing industry. And they say, well, France needs that. And Bastiat would say, well, that's not exactly true. What you're actually arguing is that certain powerful business interests want the government to subsidise manufacturing, subsidise iron and steel making. He said that he would argue that the prime focus of economists and politicians should be the consumer. What impact does this have on the consumer? Well, I mean, to have protection means you can't buy from the cheapest market or the cheapest producer. You don't have the same choice. You don't have. You have all these higher price of food. You have perhaps some people making huge amounts of money at taxpayer expense. And he says that's got everything completely wrong. He says everything should be seen from the perspective of the consumer, and that's where protectionists today, he would see them as very much part of this long tradition of private interests trying to cloak their private interests by saying, well, this is in the nation's interest that we have a strong aluminum or a strong steel industry, which means we have to keep out foreign competitors. And he would say, there's nothing new about this. This has been going on for centuries. And it's morally wrong because it deprives consumers and producers from buying and selling with whomever they like. It's also bad for the economy because it stops the economy from improving because it's not exposed to the competition that causes improvements to take place. And then, you have this problem of class. I mean, the people who do get benefits are well organised and they were eventually, in many countries, come to dominate the parliament or the chamber and become entrenched. That's a political problem. But Bastiat's quite interesting because when he's on the streets of Paris handing out his little newspapers, Jacques Bonhomme, he put in the first issue a statement of his and his friends' principles, and he is a strong Republican, in the sense of Republican government, not monarchical, a strong believer in democracy. Right? Everyone who's a taxpayer should have the right to vote. Right? So that's where many of the classical liberals were very uneasy about giving the right to vote to the working class. It was a long struggle in England to get that right. So people like Tocqueville were very worried about giving the vote. The lesson from modern economists, what I found interesting about his life and why I thought it'd be a great movie could be made about him is because how many economists today could you imagine getting on the streets of a big city handing out leaflets in the middle of a revolution? And Bastiat did that twice and wrote some very interesting letters where he talks about, we came under fire today, handing out our magazine on the streets. Because he was a member of the Chamber of Deputies, he had an ID, saying I'm a deputy, and he and his mates were able to use his parliamentary ID to persuade the army officer who was firing on the barricades to have a truce so that Bastiat and some of his friends could drag the dead and dying off the barricades into the side streets where they could get some treatment. So he's a hands-on economist. I mean, he's, some great images there for my film that'll probably never be made.
With his use of fables and things, I'm wondering, is there any evidence was he influenced by Mandeville, or do we know what he thought about the fable of the bees?
No, but there was an interesting tradition. The pioneer of this actually was going back to Jean-Baptiste Say. I wrote a paper on this, on the history of the popularisation of economic ideas from Say to Jusset. Tony de Jusset was a very, very, very good populariser of economic thought who wrote for one of the Liberty Fund websites, the EconLib website. Say was concerned when the first edition of his treatise came out in 1803, then there was a second one in 1814, and he was very worried that it was too complex for a lot of readers, and so he wanted to have a popular version of this, and he called it his economic catechism, where he tried to use the Catholic catechism model to have questions and answers about commonly asked economic issues. And it is absolutely dreadful. It is so boring and dull. I mean, it's just a horrible attempt to popularise economics that turn people off economics. So Say failed miserably. And then in the 1820s and 30s in England, there were these two women writers, who were Jane Marcet and Harriet Martineau. And they are very interesting because they are some of the first professional women writers at a time when women were not, there weren't that many women who could make money out of writing. And what they did was they wrote some very successful popularisations of economic ideas. And they were translated into French, and so I know Molinari knew about them, and Bastiat surely must have known about them. So that could have been one inspiration for him, were these pioneering English women who wrote these. They sold in their thousands. They went through dozens of editions. Imagine that. I mean, this is... And they're also pretty dull. I mean, they're just... But Bastiat, with his genius, is able to turn economics into a very witty and clever and amusing. When I first read Bastiat, I was in high school in Australia, and
everyone reads Bastiat in Australia, no?
Yeah, it's like our mother's milk.
Yes.
And I read him, and I thought, oh, he's really clever and witty, and I put it aside and went on to read Hayek and Mises and Rothbard, and just dismissed him, like everyone else did, as a mere journalist. And it was only when, after Liberty Fund agreed to take on this publishing translation project of Bastiat, that they ran into difficulties. And I was working at Liberty Fund, and they said, well, you've written on French classical liberal thought, can you take over the project? And I then went back and reread Bastiat in French, which I hadn't read it in English before. And I went on and wrote a thesis on some other French classical liberals like Charles Compton, Dunoyer, and Molinari. And I went back and read Bastiat, and I said, "Whoa, David, you got this guy wrong." You know, there is such a depth of knowledge and insight and wit that my colleague Don Boudreau, who writes for Café Hayek, blog site, wrote an interesting piece where he said Bastiat is wasted on the young. That there's too much in there for younger readers to fully comprehend. And as I've tried to show you in some of these extracts from the book, to uncover some of the depth to Bastiat is a difficult process, but it's rewarding, I think, because it shows every page is full of, you know, his puns on words and plays on words are just so clever and funny. And he's also hard-hitting. I mean, he's really committed to the interests of the consumer, of the ordinary person. He's not afraid to, as the French say, appeler au chat, you know, to call a cat, or as we say, to call a spade. He says, what they're doing is theft. This is plunder. This is... You know, and he's refreshing to read.
So in the age of Trump, free trade seems to be a lost cause. What would he say to us today about the tariffs? And,
well, I think he would see Trump as a figure that could be easily mocked. And that's what Bastiat did best, was in satire and his wit, he would show that not only are Trump's ideas false, but they're also embarrassingly devoid of intellectual theoretical content. So he would see him as I can't imagine what name he would come up for, because he liked to invent names to make fun of his characters. So. Blockhead, I think that's already been used. The French word was actually la souche that he used, and la souche was like a stump that you would graft a new branch from another tree onto to grow, and so I called him Blockhead. That was my translation for la souche.
Other points, questions, thoughts? We don't have to belabor the point. Seems to me that this is a case of what you've done with editing is absolutely extraordinary. So thank you on behalf of the readers. I've been privileged to work with you on 3 volumes, and I learned a lot from that. But it seems to me that editing this author's work is such a subterranean work that you never get the credit that you deserve. So on behalf of the readers, I'd like to thank you for taking the leadership of this project. But there's something very rewarding when you bring to life an author that was previously unknown or misread or partially interpreted, and you reveal to the readership the richness of that work. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity.
Well, to go back to Schumpeter, you know, he said not only that Bastiat was no theorist at all, he went on to be even more harsh. He said Bastiat was like a bather who goes for a swim and who rapidly gets out of his depth. And even Hayek, when Hayek wrote the preface to the selected essays on political economy that the Foundation for Economic Education published in 1964, he agrees. He says he was no theorist at all. He was just a brilliant economic journalist. And of all people, Hayek got to see some of the Austrian insights that Bastiat was coming up with. But I think that's part of Hayek's general dislike of French things. He suffers from Scotia-philia. He loves all things Scottish.
But nothing very different.
Yeah, I'm actually reading the Constitution of Liberty right now, and his barbs at the French are quite entertaining.
Yeah? Well, read the Individualism, True and False. He doesn't understand the French liberals that I know. I think he must be talking about another country, another group of French liberals.
He made an exception for Tocqueville,
yes.
So he's legitimate on that front. Well, if we don't have any other thoughts, thank you for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Appreciate you taking time, and thank you again, David.